LAO and our peer review group, thank you for your patience. So, Mr. Kelly and your group, if you wouldn't mind just hanging around in case some questions come up during this, after this panel, it would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you.
So we're going to go ahead and start with the LAO first. Tom, would you please introduce yourself and then proceed?
Good afternoon, Tom Mahiki with the Legislative Analyst's Office. The sergeant's distributing a handout that I'll be referring to that parallels my remarks this afternoon. Thanks again for having us here as part of these proceedings. As you know, the California High-Speed Rail Authority is required to produce a business plan every even year that provides certain key information about the planned high-speed rail system. Generally, our office reviews that plan and offers analysis to the legislature. This presentation is going to provide some background information on the planned system. I think it's useful, given the number of acronyms and component parts of this complex project, to just set the stage. It'll describe the major changes proposed in the draft 2018 business plan and identify some issues for legislative consideration. On page 2 of the handout, we make reference to Proposition 1A, which specifies certain criteria and conditions that the high-speed rail system must ultimately achieve. That's really how the project got started. For example, the measure requires electric trains capable of operating speeds of at least 200 miles per hour and specifies minimum travel times along specific routes. The overall project vision is divided into 2 phases. Phase 1 of the system would provide service for about 500 miles from San Francisco to Anaheim. Phase 2 would extend the system north to Sacramento and south to San Diego. In 2016, the authority estimated that Phase 1 of the system would be completed in 2029 and cost about $64 billion. The authority has not provided estimates of the cost or schedule for Phase 2. On page 3, I'll discuss the project delivery plan for Phase 1. Delivery of Phase 1 is divided into segments. Phase 1 of the high-speed rail project is divided into 2 segments for our purposes today. According to the authority, the first operation of high-speed rail in the state will be after construction of the initial operating segment. That's the IOS that we've been referring to this afternoon. That's going to connect the Silicon Valley to the Central Valley and is commonly referred to as the Valley-to-Valley line. In 2016, the authority estimated that the IOS would cost about $21 billion and initially operate between San Jose and a terminus north of Bakersfield, starting in 2025. Construction of the initial operating segment began with the initial construction segment in the Central Valley in 2015. The ICS extends for 119 miles through the Central Valley from Madeira, about 25 miles north of Fresno, to Shafter, about 20 miles north of Bakersfield. In 2016, the authority estimated completing construction of the ICS at a cost of $7.3 billion. To date, on page 4, the project has received capital funding primarily from 3 sources. The first of those, of course, are Proposition 1A bonds. This authorized the state to sell $10 billion in general obligation bonds to support the development of the high-speed rail system. At this time, the state has sold about $2.3 billion in Proposition 1A bonds, and as of December, the authority had spent or committed about $1.7 billion of that total. Federal funds are the second major source of capital funding. The authority has received a total of $3.5 billion in federal funds. $2.6 billion of that is from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The authority has fully expended those particular funds as of September 2017. Second, the state received a $929 million grant, commonly referred to as the FY10 grant. That has not yet been accessed, as CEO Kelly indicated. Finally, of course, cap and trade auction revenues are the third major leg of this stool. The state began providing cap and trade auction proceeds to the authority in the amount of 25% annual continuous appropriations beginning in 2015-16. At this time, a total of roughly $1.5 billion in cap and trade revenues have been provided to the authority. And as of December 2017, the authority had spent almost $600 million of those funds. The authority already gave us an overview of the major features of the draft 2018 business plan, so I won't dwell on these for too long, but beginning on page 5, you'll note that we've got a map indicating Phase 1, the initial operating segment, and the initial construction segment, those are subsets of the others. It's worth underscoring again that the draft 2018 plan proposes to change the scope of the IOS, extending it to San Francisco and into Bakersfield, thus connecting it to larger population centers. It also assumes a delay in the operation of that IOS, now in 2029, 4 years later than assumed in the 16 plan. A major feature of the 2018 plan, here we are at the top of page 6, it proposes early interim services on completed construction segments. Previously, under the 16 plan, no rail services were expected to begin until full completion of the IOS. As Mr. Kelly noted, the authority now proposes to launch early interim services on the San Francisco to Gilroy corridor and on the completed ICS. The plan suggests that those completed segments could host enhanced Caltrain or Amtrak services or potentially abbreviated high-speed rail operations. Project construction costs have been revised upward by about a total of $13 billion for the whole Phase 1, moving from $64 to $77 billion. A table at the bottom of page 6 summarizes the relevant numbers for the various segments of the project. On page 7, we discuss the project funding plan. The draft plan identifies full funding for the ICS from various fund sources, including Proposition 1A bonds, federal grants, and cap-and-trade revenues. To complete the IOS, the plan assumes further extension of cap-and-trade and the securitization of those revenues. This plan is, the cap-and-trade program, is currently only authorized, of course, through 2030. Finally, it assumes that additional funding becomes available for the remainder of Phase 1. The balance of construction of Phase 1, that is from Bakersfield South to Anaheim via Los Angeles, is currently estimated to cost $47.8 billion. While the plan does not identify specific funding sources and amounts to fund that construction, it does discuss some potential sources, including a combination of federal sources and borrowing against the net operating revenues of the IOS. On page 8, we begin 4 issues for legislative consideration. The first is that actual project costs could be even higher. The authority noted, of course, that they are now presenting costs in ranges, and they deserve credit for that. I think that's an improvement. But that also means that the cost of the project could be substantially higher than that headline number of $77 billion that you've heard about, up to as high as $98 billion, in fact. Several factors remain to be decided. Those include final design decisions, procurements, and there could be construction delays that are hard to foresee at this stage, and those could all potentially affect that eventual actual cost. There are significant uncertainties regarding funding to complete the IOS. As we've noted, a large portion of the funding identified for the IOS would come from borrowing against future cap-and-trade auction revenues through 2050. Thus, without legislative action to extend the cap-and-trade program, the total cap-and-trade funds the authority plans to use to complete the IOS would probably not be available. To the extent that that level of auction revenues assumed in the draft plan does not materialize, or the costs are higher than expected in those baseline estimates, the state would need to identify other fund sources to help finance the IOS. The general fund would be one of those sources. There's no complete funding plan for the remainder of Phase 1. While the draft plan discusses the possibility of securitizing the net operating revenues of the IOS, there are several potential challenges to this approach. First, it's unclear that the initial system will actually generate an operating surplus. Second, the authority anticipates that securitizing the net cash flow would make additional funding available no sooner than 2032, even though funds would likely be needed earlier to complete Phase 1 by 2033, as assumed in the plan. Third, the plan estimates that the amount of funding that could be generated would fall substantially short of the level needed to complete Phase 1, and does not specifically identify how the shortfall would be met. As I mentioned, that balance of construction, the estimate for that is about $47.8 billion, and the plan indicates that securitizing net operating revenues might bring in $10, $11, $12 billion in financing proceeds. Finally, on page 9, just to underscore, a full funding plan is crucial for the success of the high-speed rail project. And at this time, a complete and viable funding plan to complete the IOS and the remainder of Phase 1 does not exist. Ross Brown, who's our cap-and-trade expert, is here with me as well, and would be happy to entertain any questions.
No, Mr. Chair, but happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lou Thompson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear here today, and I want especially to thank you for the kind words you said about what we've tried to do so far. We've found it a great pleasure to work with you and with your staff. We are acutely conscious of the difficulty and the complexity of the decisions that you're facing right now, and anything we can do to contribute to that is, I think, worthwhile. We very much enjoy it. I want to present Marty Wax's apologies. A last-minute schedule problem took him out of this. I'm the chairman of the peer review committee as a group that is noted, and we report to the legislature. There have been some 15 reports to date to the legislature on the status of the high-speed rail project. We sent a letter to the chairman and chairman on the Senate side as well, commenting on the draft 2018 business plan last Friday. I want to summarize those comments today. They fall in two categories. One is the policy issues that you're going to be facing, and the other is some comments on the content of the plan itself. And I really want to focus first on the policy issues because I think they are much more important. We believe that the high-speed project has now reached a critical point where difficult decisions need to be made about the project's future scope and funding. Quite simply, as a result of cost increases and changes in the funding sources, the authority can no longer complete a link from the Central Valley either to the LA Basin or to San Jose and the peninsula. Thus, as it stands today, there is little prospect for a system that would generate enough cash flow to contribute to future investment. This dilemma does not come as a surprise. It happens nearly every time when we try to translate a mega project from a grand vision into a working system, and it is not necessarily a reflection on the competence or honesty of the people at the authority who have been trying to build the system. The critical question, though, is where do we go from here? The draft plan doesn't really lay out the choices in addressing this question. The group laid out 4 broad options, but these were meant basically to provoke a debate. There could be other options that anyone could enter into this. First option is we could just stop where we are, pay off whatever we have to pay off, and cut our losses. The second option is that we could complete what we're doing in the Central Valley, basically, and create whatever value we could create there, and the work that's committed on the ends, and stop there. The third option, we could do what in effect the business plan is suggesting, which is complete the Central Valley, add the connections to Gilroy and Bakersfield, and improve LA Union Station while waiting to find out what the Pacheco Pass tunnels are going to cost and how we might go about financing that. Or fourth, we could recommit to the full phase 1 with the understanding that such a decision would have to be based on the adoption of a credible long-term plan to finance the system, including the possibility that system costs might well come in at the high end of the range. We don't view the first option, simply stopping, as credible. It would leave us with nothing useful, and we would probably still have to pay back the federal era money. The second option, stopping with the Central Valley plus the bookend improvements, would work, but it would limit the value of the result. The third option, as in the draft plan, probably makes the best use of the existing situation, especially in bringing near-term benefits to the millions of current passengers on the bookends, but it leaves the state short of a system that would be able to contribute to financing of the remainder of the system. The fourth option, which would be completing Phase A as originally planned, does meet the requirements of Prop 1A, but it cannot be done with current funding provisions or sources. Simply put, we do not believe that it is fair or credible any longer to ask management to deliver a long-term project of this size and complexity with sources of funding that are inadequate in total and unreliable in any given year. If the project is to go ahead beyond essentially the second option, the state will need to develop a source of funding that is up to the task. This is not a new issue. There has always been a funding gap of some size depending on the assumptions about cost and income. It was clear in the 2016 business plan that there was a funding gap of around $14 billion for the medium estimate, and there was an additional $10 billion that was needed to get to the point where revenues could be generated from selling the service itself. In other words, there was somewhere around $20 billion that would be needed to get to the point where investment money from the private sector could be generated. What is new is the increasing size of the gap, along with a clearer understanding of the need to make the high-speed rail authority's funding stable and predictable. There are obvious ways to deal with this. You could increase the share of cap-and-trade receipts going to the project. You could guarantee their income or permit them to issue some kind of guarantee bonds against the state, against predicted revenues. There could be a tax on fuels, or a sales tax was proposed in the 2000 business plan. There are other sources that might emerge, like future federal grant programs, federal loans, etc., but then again, they might not. The problem will need to be addressed in one way or another if even the third option or beyond is to be completed. In parallel with dealing with the need for an improved approach to funding, especially because the state's role is likely to grow, we recommend that the legislature revalidate the priority of the high-speed rail in the light of the competing needs elsewhere in the transportation and overall in the state's budget. This is the task that the governor's office and the Department of Transportation, along with the communities affected, would be well suited to carry out for the legislature. I note, Mr. Chairman, your question and another question about the benefits other than revenues and costs. This was actually addressed in earlier business plans where they did attempt an economic social benefit cost analysis of the study and how much that was worth. It wouldn't be that difficult to recommission that kind of work, and you might want to consider that. We do have some recommendations for specific changes in the final plan. One, we believe they would benefit from including and reporting on the inputs from the early operator as soon as possible. We have long argued for the inclusion of the advice of an early operator. Now they've acquired the early operator, we should begin to see the inputs from that early operator as soon as possible. We need a better explanation of the business model. This may sound strange, but this is not a construction project. What we're actually doing is building a business to serve the people of the state of California. And yet, the business plan doesn't provide the kind of structure and description we think should be provided of what is it going to look like when it actually arrives, who's going to do what to whom. We need to put more emphasis on developing detailed agreements with the bookend operators and the freight railroads. This sounds simple. It is anything but simple. When 2 or 3 operators have to live together on the same piece of track, especially freight and commuters, and they have to decide who gets what priority, who pays what to whom, it is very complex. And these are the decisions should not be left to the last minute. They need to develop, we need to develop, and I put the emphasis on we, a long-range program for addressing grade crossings, especially because more services now are going to be provided jointly between San Jose and Gilroy. And in the Burbank to Anaheim area, more and more encounters are going to be there between automobiles or trucks or gas trucks and high-speed trains. Now, this can't be solved immediately, and it is not a problem just for the High-Speed Rail Authority. It's a problem for them, plus commuter railways, plus freight railways, plus the highway authorities, plus everybody involved. But it should start now, and Caltrans would be a good place to ask that it begin. We need to clarify the performance of the system as shown in trip time calculations and schedules. I am informed that they are still technically capable of meeting the 2-hour, 40-minute trip time, but I think continuing attention to that would be worthwhile. We would like to continue the emphasis on showing projections as ranges rather than point estimates. That's absolutely important. In fact, I think it would be useful to expand that to include the capital estimates as well, so we can begin to get a good sense of what's the probability of various kinds of outcomes, not only the expected outcome, but what happens if it all goes wrong. We don't have that yet, but we could have that if this work is extended to give us that information. Finally, we think they need to provide better backup for claims for benefits to urban and regional development. The benefits are clear, but the backup for what, how much, what is it worth, what will it do? While we hope these can be addressed, these more technical points can be addressed in the final plan, we believe the legislature's immediate focus should be on the funding and policy issues. Thank you, and if these are big questions, but if I can help you in answering them, I would certainly like to try.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Any questions of the committee of the panel? Assemblymember Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for a very clear overview of what you're looking at and the work that you've put into it. And I want to go back to one of the last 2 points you were making about trip times. You said, I am informed that it's still technically possible for this to be 2 hours and 40 minutes. And then I think we heard a little earlier, I think your summary said about 3 hours potentially. How much scrutiny, like real scrutiny, rigorous scrutiny, have the trip times received independent from what High-Speed Rail Authority is saying will happen?
I've discussed this issue with them. There is something in railway parlance called a train performance calculator. It's a computer program that takes all of the various assumptions into account and predicts a trip time for the train. That, I believe, is still showing less than 2 hours and 40 minutes for a train that starts in San Francisco and doesn't stop until it gets to Los Angeles. They will never schedule that train, nor will the operating schedule ever show that kind of trip time. It will be more like 3 hours and 10 minutes, which their business plans have shown for scheduled trains with 3 stops. That's not unreasonable, and the demand forecasting that they've done is consistent with that. Our point has been especially that the demand forecasting should be consistent with the actual schedule, not with the optimum possible runtime. But there is an issue of what does the legislation actually require, and it appears technically that it requires that the system be designed to yield a train performance calculator time of less than 2 hours and 40 minutes, and technically they can do that.
And with the air marks that you're making with that, I mean, what I'm hearing is that it has to technically be designed to do that, although it may never do that.
No, they will not do
it will never do 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Not as it stands now. Obviously, over time, other things could be done if you wanted to build a brand new track from San Francisco to San Jose or to Gilroy and separate it completely and separate.
It's a lot of cost.
It could be done.
Yeah, okay.
But
well, technically it could be done, but it has been designed.
And I wouldn't argue that they necessarily should do that. I think that what we're circling in on might well be the best answer to the problem.
And on the trip time point, I think you have this in your report, and we certainly hear this from our constituents. It's one of the criticisms about calling it high-speed rail is, folks feel like for the amount of money that you can pay me to fly on any given very convenient airline, I won't pitch one in particular here, I can get from LA or Burbank to Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco for about the same amount of money, if not less, for the rest of my life, and that travel will only get more efficient and convenient, especially with all the other advances that we make on how you get to an airport or other ports of travel. Has the High-Speed Rail Authority ever, in any of its reports, I don't think it does in this business plan, try to acknowledge what are the opportunity costs for where else we could put those dollars to get mobility faster like that? Or the airline option or other options?
They have, in a number of plans, made calculations of how many lanes of highway can be avoided by building high-speed rail, or what other investments can be avoided by investing it this way. I don't think, except in the broader sense of economic benefits and cost, I'm not sure I've ever seen a study that says what this would do in the health area if we didn't do it in the high-speed rail area.
Well, and I think legislation from last year actually prohibits the ability of us to add more lanes, in new places in order to relieve congestion. So I don't know that we're able to compare something fairly. If we're comparing high-speed rail to something that we've now decided as a state that we're not really going to be able to do, I'm not sure that that's a fair comparison.
It's impossible to answer these questions precisely. What I've said is that I don't think we can build more of the past and call it the future. We just can't do that. It won't work. I think 100 years from now, I personally believe people will thank us for doing it. But it's going to be difficult. And yes, there are hard trade-offs that have to be made. And that's, again, given what's happening now, you may well want to take advantage of this opportunity to ask those questions.
Well, absolutely, and that's going to my next one, which is there's other options. You lay out a summary of what is identified as potentially different options. One is stopping, just stopping, which many Californians say, please don't spend another penny on this. Because I'd rather see those dollars go into what we believe will have a higher increase of quality of life and mobility and other good impacts. And you mentioned you did not think that was appropriate because if I want to say this correctly, we would be left with an asset that can't be used for anything.
That's right.
Okay. The second option you mentioned, you thought, which is the complete sum of the line, what would we really be left with there that is of value?
You would be left with better service on the San Joaquins to somewhere near Bakersfield. You would be left with much better service in the Caltrain area. You would be left with much better service or significant improvements on the south end, including the Rosecrans Marquardt. I had the same problem with that.
I don't even use that word.
Great crossings, and you would have better service.
And one of
But would you have done it to do just that? No, you probably wouldn't.
Yeah, and that's our decision, is that your point earlier about the future and using the past and the future, I mean, the reality is this is where we are going to spend these dollars. I am thinking 100 years if we stop this project, but we've done great connections between mega regions. We've invested in future of technologies. We might have a generation thanking us for spending the dollars that way and not having the operating costs that take away from transportation into this. We don't know. That's the decision we have to make. Finally, you mentioned you may want to look at other options. That there's 4 that are kind of summarized a little bit. But what other options do you think we should be looking at beyond the 4 that are sort of out there? Or what possibilities would you say we want to be sure to consider?
That's a good question. I suppose one option would be putting more money in conventional rail passenger service and maybe less in high speed. For example, a much better connection from Sacramento, better service on the ACE trains, better service, better connection from LA to San Diego. Things that would not involve 220 miles an hour, but would involve better service on the existing lines where there are a lot of passengers already. And what I really hope we can do is provoke exactly this kind of discussion. I think it's important.
And the last is the private funding. Often we get questions about where's the private funding that at least folks feel like they heard about 10 years ago when this was debated. And I understand that's well off into the future. What do you think is the likelihood of that being triggered and coming to the rescue?
I think it's highly likely at some point that there will be some form of private investment in the system. Let's suppose you get to a point where you're running trains and you show a lot of demand and a lot of profitability, and then you say, how much money will you offer me to run my system for me? I think we could well get to that point. But the point we were making is that getting to that point requires an awful lot of investment that we right now have got to find.
Thank you, colleagues, for the question time.
So we'll go to Vice Chair Fong, and then we'll go to Mr. Mathis.
Just a couple of quick questions. To the LAO, in terms of the assumptions being made in the business plan, do you assess, or in your analysis, do you believe that those assumptions are realistic?
Could you be more specific about which assumptions you're referring to?
The monetization of the cap and trade, the debt service, the assumption that cap and trade is going to be extended to 2050. There's a lot of assumptions that to somehow make this project work. Or do you believe those are realistic?
I think in terms of the assumptions for cap and trade revenue, I'll let Ross speak to that. In general, the authority is proposing a set of actions that would make that revenue stream financeable. and those appear to be reasonable to our analysis. We don't think there's necessarily much more or much less that they would need to do to satisfy the investment community that money would be sufficiently investment grade, as they say.
And I mean, as far as the assumption on cap and trade and sort of the steps that would need to be taken to make that secure, I mean, those are assumptions about actions taken by a future legislature. And so those are, I mean, it's difficult for us to say sort of, what types of actions the legislature will take, but, those, it's helpful to kind of have those outlined and kind of know what types of steps might need to be taken in order to kind of make that funding more secure that can, and kind of in a way that use it in a way that you can securitize it or finance things. As far as the cap and trade revenue and kind of what to expect in the out years, as was mentioned, the program is only currently authorized through 2030. So one of those key actions would be extending the program out to 2050. But even the revenue out to 2030, the authority kind of referenced some of our numbers that we put out in a recent report, which provides sort of a low revenue scenario and a high revenue scenario out to 2030. I think, a couple important points. One, those aren't absolute bounds on revenue. I mean, it is even possible in certain years that revenue would drop, below a couple $1 billion in a particular year, or it could be quite a bit higher than, 6, 7, 8 billion that we outlined as sort of our high revenue scenario. So that's important to keep in mind. And I can get into as much detail as you would like on all the various factors that affect cap and trade revenue uncertainty, but at a high revenue or a high level, revenue depends on allowance prices and the number of allowances sold, and those factors depend on things like economic conditions, technological advancements, as well as a variety of regulatory decisions that the California Air Resources Board has yet to make on things like the price ceiling,
Sure.
Number of allowances that are going to be issued, how many are given away for free, those types of things. So just to give you a sense.
Let me crystallize, I guess, my concern, my question. And sure. I know as the chair indicated, cap and trade, as the program unfolds, the revenues will reduce over time, I guess, as the chair stipulated. So how I see it is we have an uncertain funding plan, which is on page 8, you use uncertainty a lot in your analysis. And then we have a volatile source of funding to plug a lot of gaps in this draft plan. Is that a correct assessment?
I think that's a fair characterization.
And then my last question, in terms of the most effective use of cap and trade dollars, because I think there's a lot of debate in this building about that. Is there an analysis done in terms of the cost-benefit analysis of should we use cap and trade dollars for this versus other ways of reducing whatever? So if we have a delta of $50 to $70 billion for this project, could we use that money for other purposes more effectively? Is that analysis being done, or can the LAO do that?
I mean, I think it largely depends on the legislature's priorities. I mean, this is, money that the legislature could make a variety of different decisions on how to spend it, and it depends, sort of your measure of effectiveness depends on exactly what you're trying to achieve. The administration does produce a report annually where they try to estimate greenhouse gas reductions, and so there's some information in there, and there's a wide range of programs and estimated costs per ton of emission reduction. So that type of information is available, and we have some issues with some of the estimates, but there's a little bit of information there. But we think the legislature, and we've encouraged the legislature to think a little bit more broadly even than greenhouse gas emission reductions. The regulation itself, cap and trade, is intended to help the state meet its greenhouse gas targets. And so we think the legislature should think broadly about how it could use this money on a variety of things, whether it be greenhouse gas reductions, local air pollutant reductions, or things even outside of that scope that the legislature considers a high priority. So thinking about that wide range of opportunity costs is important in our view.
Well, if the LAO could assist in that, I'd really appreciate that.
Of course.
Mr. Mathis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got to start with this. I mean, the review, the summary you guys give us is great, with the fact that there are a lot of assumptions. You go through a lot of options of, if we had the money, we could do this, or if we had this, we could do this. But I've really got to ask, and this is the question, quite frankly, that I get asked at home all of the time when it comes to high-speed rail and private funding, is why aren't we looking to privatize this and do something? I mean, we hear all the time and on Facebook feeds and everything else about the awesome things guys like Elon Musk are doing, and I straight up get asked, Assemblyman Mathis, how come we aren't talking to Elon Musk to privatize this and get private dollars to do this on something that we know the technology is much faster, and it still gives all of our guys the jobs and the building and everything else. It still gives all of that. So we're still going to be able to have the workforce. We're going to have the job development. We're going to have everything we're getting from high-speed rail on the job front, but we're actually going to get private dollars and somebody with better technology, quite frankly. I mean, these are the questions I get asked on a daily basis when I'm at home. So I'm asking you guys, what is your answer to that? And how come, if we're looking and all options are on the table, good sir, why isn't that something that's being explored?
The answer to that, I think, is that if there were only private benefits and private costs, then we could let Elon take care of it. But that's not the case. There are manifest public benefits associated with this, like pollution, like congestion, like safety, like noise, like environmental impacts, that the private sector will not pay for and we can't ask them to. There are also public costs that, like opportunity costs, where else, I hate to sound like an economist, I swore I never would, but I've gotten into this from time to time. There are public costs that also no private entity will take into account one way or the other. The question on these kind of projects, and this is exactly what happens in Europe, is the sum of the public and private benefits equal to the sum of the public and private costs. And the only way to determine that one is to try to put a number or some value on what the public benefits are. How much is it worth to us to eliminate 20 grade crossing deaths a year between San Francisco and San Jose? How much is it worth it to us to reduce congestion between San Jose and San Francisco? Elon Musk can't generate the money to pay for that. Only the public sector can do that. And the question is the combination of public money and private money equal to the benefits that we both derive?
Are you saying you don't see the possibility of a public-private partnership?
That's exactly what they're talking about, but only at the second phase of this. Once you've gone past the point of getting it in operation, then you can sell the private benefits to the private sector. But the public benefits remain on the public side, as they should.
LAO, you guys have anything related to that? Or have you guys even looked at anything like that?
That's outside the scope of the analysis that we've conducted on this draft business plan, and I don't have a whole lot more to add to what Lou said, but it just underscored that the draft plan does envision, once the iOS is operational, securitizing those revenues, and that would involve private sector involvement in financing the rest of phase one.
All right. I'll bring that back to my constituents. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Any other questions of the committee of the panel? I will just add, Mr. Mathis, that Mr. Musk would have to also acquire all the right-of-way.
Public-private.
Yeah, no. Still got to acquire the right-of-way, which is an onerous task, as we can see. This is a question for the, I got you. This is to the LAO. Are the actions items requested by the authority of the legislature to finance cap and trade doable, and would it require a vote of the people?
I think we need to discuss with council in a little more detail to get a specific answer on which items would require a vote of the people, but it's conceivable that some of them might. Generally speaking, the actions that the authority is requesting seem to be what would be necessary to make cap and trade revenues investment grade.
Another question would be, does the LAO have any recommendations for additional oversight measures that would be taken by the legislature or the administration? And I'll just use SB1 as an example. Caltrans now has an inspector general. that is part of that process, watching over that agency with a 6-year term. Did you guys consider other oversight measures that the legislature could be part of?
We hadn't considered that question, but we could work with your staff to consider answering that perhaps in more detail. It's worth noting, of course, that the Joint Audit Committee has also launched an audit of the High-Speed Rail Authority and the project, and that's a positive step.
And my understanding is that that audit will be done in latter part of May.
I think it's a several-month process, but I'd need to double-check that to give you a correct answer.
Okay. Lou, and again, Mr. Thompson, thank you so much. I wish every project had this ability for the dedication that your committee has given and the professionalism that is brought and the awareness to the legislature. It has been absolutely phenomenal, the support you've given us, and I can't thank you enough working with my staff and some of the committee members going forward. The draft plan contains recommendations of needed actions for the legislature to take to enable the authority to finance cap and trade funds. Would these actions be sufficient to build the system? And is this the best option for funding the IOS?
Well, first I should thank you for saying nice things, and then not so much for that question anyway.
I'm just going to put you on the spot there.
I think the answer is no, it won't be sufficient to finish the system. There is more that will have to be done, especially if you really want to rededicate to doing phase 1 and finishing it. That only if you were to say all of the cap and trade money goes to high-speed rail, and only if the higher end estimates were to come about, would that be enough to suffice. Otherwise, other sources are going to have to be found. Not necessarily after it's in operation, but to get it to the point where it can operate.
Well, based on that, does the peer review group believe that the financing plan for the IOS is viable?
Not entirely. I think more will need to be done over a period of time to get us there, especially if, as we said, you have to plan for the high end of the estimates to come true rather than the middle or the more favorable numbers. There will be more that will need to be done. And I think, again, if you're going to go forward with phase 1 type ambition, you really need to plan for the upper end of the range, not the mid part of it. I'd love to have it turn out better, but I would, as I said, I'm an optimist in my hopes, but I'm a realist in my plans. And in this case, I think realism would say plan for completing it under adverse outcome.
Understand. So do you think that the early service on the Central Valley line or the San Francisco to Gilroy line might violate Proposition 1A as no subsidy mandate?
Well, I think that's a good question. It isn't clear to me what the early service of high-speed rail from San Jose to San Francisco or Gilroy might entail. I don't even know that they really would do that. And I certainly think the contribution of this money to Caltrain's performance would be positive, and we don't need to worry about that. What would the service would look like between in the Central Valley, again, other than testing? I don't know that high-speed rail, I don't know exactly what they would do. I think the initial service would be to allow Amtrak to use the high-speed rail tracks, or San Joaquin's, which would be a good thing, and that would contribute to the performance of the San Joaquin's. Whether you would have high-speed rail trains in effect competing with the San Joaquin's at the outset, I really don't know, and I don't think that's been well enough defined.
So LAO and Mr. Thompson, have you ever thought about if there was a possibility of a revenue generating component of high-speed freight that would actually be able to augment the system in some kind of futuristic kind of concept where some of the foreign companies that are foreign high-speed rail have that dynamic? And when you look about the advantage of less truck miles traveled, mobility and throughput based on this, would it be another option in your viewpoint as a viable source of income that might be integrated?
No, I really don't think so. I think the experience with high-speed passenger trains are a very special beast, and they have a different market and a different set of customers and a different set of technical requirements. Every time passenger railroads have tried to operate freight services, they've had trouble. Now, high priority package service, Federal Express kind of stuff, yes, that's a possibility. But anything beyond that, I would be suspicious of it.
Understood, and I appreciate that candor. So last question for me, Mr. Thompson, can you walk us through what would happen if this project stopped?
Well, that would depend on how it stopped. If you just stopped now, you would have nothing of value left in the valley, nothing really to use, and you'd have to pay back the federal money. That's apparently what would happen. If instead you said, complete what you're doing in the Central Valley and complete what you're doing with Caltrain electrification plus the work on the south end, you would not end up with high-speed service in the Central Valley, really, of any great value. You would have much enhanced Caltrain service, and you would have enhanced service on the grade crossing in the south. And that you wouldn't have to pay back the federal money because you would at least complete something operative in the Central Valley, and then that would be it, as I understand it.
And not only that value lost, but also all of the jobs that have been committed, people that have committed resources, it would be in that region just an absolute economic devastation.
That would end.
Yeah. So, and the impact on the economy would be?
That part that's dependent on finishing this construction or operations would be harmed, yes.
Got it. Any other questions of the committee? Member Baker.
Thank you. And on that federal money, if it just stopped, maybe put the other resources into other construction and mobility projects, or I suppose one is not to spend it at all, but that federal money, is there anything that would prohibit the federal government from forgiving that? Legally, that you know?
I don't know.
Okay.
The answer is I don't know.
And if we don't reach certain milestones by early the next decade, 2022, don't we have to, is there a trigger that we have to give back federal money anyway, or am I not right about that?
The only trigger I know of was that the money had to be spent before September the 30th, 2017. Otherwise, it died. But I don't know, and that it's contingent on completing a useful segment.
By
an operable
2022?
segment. No, I don't know whether there's a deadline for
Okay.
completing.
I have one in my head that it's 2022. I thought it was something significant had to be completed. I'll do my
I'm sure the
homework and figure out
high-speed
what it
rail
is.
people can answer that question.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, that completes this round of panels. Thank you so much for your attention to detail, and we'll call our next panel up. So we'll call up Hassan Ikarada and Jim Arnett. Please bring yourself to the podium.